I said be right back. Either way, I'm going to... Okay, so I'm going to start. So I met Rick online in 2015. I had been detained at an inland border patrol checkpoint for about an hour because I was not willing to answer a citizenship question, and I thought that it was a government overreach. And after an hour of detention, they let me go after a cop came along, and then I shot Rick a message over Facebook because he had some experience with that. And at the time, he was a major in the United States Air Force. I think I shot him a message about 2:00 in the morning, to which he replied within minutes. He got me in contact with a local officer at Holloman Air Force Base that could kind of give me a feel for what I was looking at as far as disciplinary action and stuff like that. And then throughout the remainder of my career, I relied on Rick's kind of advice and guidance. I'm very hesitant to trust someone else doing the research for me, but Rick has always been the person that knows what he's talking about when he talks. So there's a few times where I leaned on his prior research to make my decisions, and it all worked out very well. Since then, I have retired. Rick has retired, and Rick is living a glamorous life, living off the land as a mountain man. But at the same time, he's also been engaged in some legal battles for First Amendment rights, among other things. So that's kind of how I know Rick, and take it away, Rick.
All right. Thanks for the bold introduction with a bunch of law students. I'm not sure that introduction is going to hold up, but I'll give it my best shot. The first thing I guess I'll do is just kind of talk about the unlawful order that I encountered when I was in the military, and then we'll talk about some of the legal things and also some of the things that are different, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not involved in the judiciary. So as an executive officer, it's slightly different from my perspective. And then we'll wrap it up with kind of talking about the order and what happened there. But I was an attack pilot in the special operations community. One of the airframes that I flew, air quotes for flew, was an unmanned aircraft. And I came into work one day, and we would have a briefing before we go and execute the mission. And in the briefing, it was made clear that the target that we were going to neutralize was an American citizen, and he was not located in a war zone, and he was not an imminent threat. Now, I had known that mission was out there, didn't realize our unit was going to get it, and was really hoping if that happened, it wouldn't fall to me. But it did. So right there on the spot, I had to make a decision. Do I fly this mission to assassinate an American citizen without due process, who is not an imminent threat and who is not even located in a war zone? All right, we'll get back to that order and what happened. First off, though, as a military officer, I worked for the executive, for the president. So I'm not a lawyer, obviously, and but that being said, I still have some obligations. So if you go to Article 6 of the Constitution, it says, quote, the senators and representatives before mentioned and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution, unquote. So, as an executive officer, as a military officer who's appointed by the president, I have an obligation. I have to swear an oath, just like the Supreme Court justices are also required in Article 6 of the Constitution to support the Constitution. All right, so you can see there's a tension there. Here I am, a military officer, and I am required to take an oath to support the Constitution. Doesn't tell me to do what the judge tells you to do. Doesn't say call a lawyer and do what they tell you to do. It puts the burden on me. So, as a military officer, as an executive officer, my oath is to the Constitution, and it is not to court rulings. Okay, so as law students, you guys are going to operate in a completely different world than I am. For you, judicial rulings, precedents, court opinions are going to be incredibly important. And that makes sense because you're going to be operating in the Article 3 judiciary. But for me, the oath is not to the judges. It's not to their judicial reasoning, although obviously that's useful because it can be very persuasive. Article 3 for you guys, Article 3 of the Constitution covers the judiciary, and it's a very short section. If you've ever read it, there's not a whole lot said about the judiciary's role in Article 3. Article 1 covers the legislature, Article 2 covers the president, Article 3 is very small, covering the judiciary. And we'll get to a little bit of what else Article 3 covers, even though it's very tiny, here in a bit. But for you guys, it says, quote, "The judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made of which shall be made under their authority," unquote. So for you guys operating in the judiciary, dealing with those cases and controversies, it makes sense. For me, as a different branch of the government, as an executive officer, I'm not beholden to any Supreme Court decisions. Now, there's a lot of military officers who would disagree with me, but that is my take on it, and that's how I operate. So if I'm not beholden to a judicial opinion or a lawyer, in a robe giving me an opinion, I'm also not beholden to a lawyer's opinion, somebody who's not a judge. And this is important because there are some OLC memos, or at least one that was written, that actually justified the assassination of one American citizen in particular. Now realize I'm not telling you the name or identity of the American citizen I refuse to assassinate. I will tell you that there were several, but this one was dealing with one citizen in particular, and there was a OLC memo that was written justifying that by David Barron. David Barron was a Harvard law professor, and he's now a federal judge for the First Circuit Court of Appeals. And he found that it was justified. His opinion, of course, wasn't provided to me. All I had at the moment was my knowledge of the Constitution. He, in his memo, he basically argues that that the Fifth Amendment provides, or may provide, is what he says, some protections for citizens that are abroad. But the argument in the memo is heavily redacted, so we don't really see what he said after that to show, in his view, that the Fifth Amendment didn't apply. But the Fifth Amendment applies or protects the right of people's, life, liberty, and property against being taken away from the federal government without due process. Now, his boss in the there in the Justice Department, the DOJ, was Eric Holder. And Eric Holder, he did go out into the law circuit, and he explained his view that it was okay to assassinate American citizens because the Fifth Amendment provides due process, not judicial process. And he would repeat that: due process, but not judicial process. For him, due process was removed from a courtroom. Now, I disagree with that. Due process would sound pretty silly if the intent of the Fifth Amendment was to say it's okay to murder Americans as long as you do so with a process. That just seems pretty silly. In addition to that, the Sixth Amendment, the very next amendment, goes through to talk about due process, about criminal charges and your right to be confronted with witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very obvious to me that due process does in fact mean judicial process. It means a trial, a jury of peers, and all of those protections from the Sixth Amendment. All right. The other problem, and to go beyond the Fifth Amendment, is in Mr. Barron's memo. Now, this memo was leaked. So this is a memo that's, written basically for the president, put in a safe to give them a get out of jail free card to do something. In his memo, where he is exploring the constitutionality of assassinating an American citizen, he never mentions Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution. So we were just talking about Article 3, that small section that gives the judiciary its boundaries and its roles. About a quarter of that small section is dedicated to defining what treason means and ensuring that treason or charges of treason provide due process. An open trial, the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act, or a confession, right? So imagine that small section that talks about the judiciary, and yet a quarter of it is dedicated to ensuring that people who are accused of treason are given due process. He never mentions that in his memo. So he's talking about the constitutionality of it, and he says that, it's fine to do it, but he yet never mentions the treason section. All right. Now, we'll go ahead and talk about Article 3, Section 3 real quick, just so everyone has it fresh in their mind. It says, quote, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. All right. So it defines treason. Here's what David Barron concluded in his memo, quote, in the present circumstances, as we understand the facts, the U.S. citizen in question has gone overseas and become part of the forces of an enemy with which the United States is engaged in armed conflict. That person is engaged in continual planning and direction of attacks upon the United States from one of the enemy's overseas bases of operations, unquote. Now, does that sound like making war on the United States? It sure does to me. This man was suspected of being a traitor, of committing treason, of making war on the United States. Yet David Barron's memo does not even address this massive section of Article 3 that covers the entire judiciary, because treason is a charge that governments use historically to violate the law. And so he doesn't even bring it up. All right. He goes on in his memo and says, quote, as we explained in our earlier memorandum, we do not believe Anwar al-Awlaki, his U.S. citizenship, imposes constitutional limitations that would preclude the contemplated lethal action under the facts represented to us by the DOD, the CIA, and the intelligence community, unquote. Okay, so here he's talking about someone that they don't want to say it's treason, but what they're talking about is someone they suspect of being a traitor. But they don't want to call him that. They come up with other names: enemy combatant, terrorist, all of this nonsense, to avoid the most obvious portion of the Constitution that covers that and makes it so very clear that the president can't just go out and assassinate an American citizen who's not an imminent threat. And you can't do that. But Mr. Barron doesn't take that on. He signs this classified memo, and he gives a pass to the President of the United States to use our military with their war machines to assassinate an American citizen. So, Anwar al-Awlaki may very well have been a traitor. He probably did commit treason, but we won't know. He didn't have his due process, and he didn't have any witnesses and any sort of ability to challenge any of the charges against him if they were even made, these charges. But I would like to point out that Judge David Barron, wrote a memo for the president to use weapons of warfare to kill a United States citizen. What is treason? Treason is making war on the United States. Okay, so David Barron is a traitor. Judge David Barron is a traitor. All right, now, full disclosure, I am familiar with Judge Barron. He clerked for Justice John Paul Stevens of the Supreme Court. My wife clerked for Justice John Paul Stevens as well, so I've seen him in multiple functions. He was at the retirement for the Justice of the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, most recently, when Justice Stevens passed away, Mr. Barron gave the eulogy there at Arlington for the justice, which I felt was fairly inappropriate to have a traitor in Arlington giving the eulogy for a Supreme Court justice who not only had a long career of serving, but also was in the military one time himself. In fact, he was credited with helping to break the code that ended up shooting down Admiral Yamamoto in World War II. And Justice Stevens, in an interview with Jeffrey Toobin, he talked about how it troubled him because here we have Admiral Yamamoto, a uniformed enemy, okay, of another nation, who went to Harvard, knew a bunch of Navy officers before there was war, and yet we use this intel and code breaking in order to track him down and kill him specifically, to assassinate him. And that troubled Justice Stevens. He thought that it was legal to do so, and I agree with him, that is legal, but it troubled him. And yet, giving the eulogy there at Arlington is a man who handed a secret memo to justify murdering an American citizen in violation of the Constitution. All right. For those of you who might go on to do something similar to Mr. Barron and work for the OLC, work for the DOJ, work for the government in some legal capacity, there's going to be a tension for you because you're going to think of your boss or your supervisor as your client. Okay, realize if you're working for the United States government, your client isn't the person who's going to sign your performance reports. Your client is the American people. And if they tell you to do something that you know is illegal, it is incumbent upon you to be honest. Your career will suffer. You won't make it to the First Circuit Court of Appeals more than likely, but it's important that you do right by your client, which is the American people. All right. In the military, we also, in our oath, for officers, we say when we take the oath to support and defend the Constitution, we do so without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion. So there are a lot of ways people can evade their responsibility. One of those ways, and this is the most common in the military, is going to be just accepting that an order is lawful because it's vetted by a JAG, right? So commanders in the military have a lawyer who's in uniform. And so any, order that comes down will be vetted by the JAG and presumed to be lawful. All right. But JAGs work for commanders. All right. And the Article 6 requirement is that we support the Constitution and not the opinion of a JAG, not the opinion of Mr. Barron's legal memo, not the opinion of a Supreme Court justice. We have to know the text, at least the parts that apply to us in the military, so that we can be faithful public servants and do our jobs properly. Now, that's a monumental task, but it's something that's very important when we're talking about the military. With all of our technology, all of our capability, we're nuclear powered. The technology is amazing today. We have to have public servants who have the character to not just say the right things, but to do the right things if they find themselves in such a position. That's an important thing. All right. So in sum, the position I was put in as a military officer, as an executive officer who has this burden for myself as a check and balance. I'm a check and balance. I have to know the Constitution, and I have to apply that to the situation I'm in. Now, there is one Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice, who said, he wrote a book, Commentaries on the Constitution, is Chief Justice Joseph Story. And he wrote, quote, "The officers of each of these departments are equally bound by their oaths of office to support the Constitution of the United States, and are therefore conscientiously bound to abstain from all acts which are inconsistent with it. Whenever, therefore, they are required to act in a case not hitherto settled by any proper authority, these functionaries must, in the first instance, decide each for himself whether, consistently with the Constitution, that act can be done." Unquote. Now, of course, there he's saying if it's not settled by a proper authority, so for him, a proper authority would be a judge, a court. So I would disagree with him on that small portion. Okay, so that's my philosophy. That's the mindset I brought to this situation. So going back, here I am in the briefing, and I'm seeing my career flash before my eyes, realize I've got 15 years in the military at this point. I'm only 5 years from retiring, and this happens. I'm on the spot, and it was not pleasant. But I refused the order right there. I said, I can't do it. This violates the Constitution. Everybody was stunned. They thought I was joking. Then they felt embarrassed because they thought I was judging all of them. And
you were.
Well, yeah, I was. But at that moment, it was about me and what I was going to do. So I didn't fly that mission. I never flew that mission, but others did. I was the only person to refuse, and that American is now dead. So here's why I refused the order. I didn't know anything about memos. I'd never heard of Mr. Barron. I knew of the Fifth Amendment, and I knew of Article 3, Section 3. So the Fifth Amendment, it says that due process is required before government can take our life, our liberty, or our property. Sixth Amendment says that due process, well, it doesn't specifically say due process, but it spells it out in for people who are accused criminally. The DOJ, in addition to this memo that Mr. Barron wrote, also issued or provided a white paper discussing why they thought they had this ability to assassinate American citizens. And in this white paper, it says that they believed that Anwar al-Awlaki specifically was a threat, was an imminent threat. All right. Now, in this white paper, what they did was they took out the actual definition of an imminent threat and they replaced it with something that I would just call threat. They said that, quote, the condition that an operational leader present an imminent threat of violent attack against the United States does not require the United States to have clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests will take place in the immediate future, unquote. So they removed the very concept of imminence, and it's understandable if you think of an imminent threat. And that's true whether, it doesn't matter where you're at. If you're a policeman, if you're a private individual in most states, if you are in Walmart and somebody provides an imminent threat to your life, you're legally justified in defending yourself. So this is nothing new. But in this case, when they tried to push the imminent threat narrative to justify it, what they had to do in order to make the imminent threat thing work was actually destroy the very concept of what imminent means. And I can tell you, an American citizen who's on an assassination list for 2 years is not an imminent threat. So the other thing that this memo talks about, or the white paper does, they both do, is they say that capture was not feasible. Now, capture is feasible. It's just a matter of whether you want to do it or not. If you can see them in order to kill them, you can see them in order to capture them. All right. Remember Manuel Noriega in Panama, right? He was suspected of trafficking drugs. He's not even an American citizen. And what did? We sent our military down there. We invaded the entire country. We lost service members. We spent a massive amount of money, and we captured him, and he died in prison after getting his day in court. But now all of a sudden, out in the middle of nowhere, in a country that's almost like Africa, like there's not a real government there, we can do whatever we want. And all of a sudden now we're claiming, okay, capture's not feasible. That is a baloney excuse. It's just not true. And in my opinion, it doesn't matter. Capture is feasible or not. It doesn't get rid of the constitutional protections. All right, so that's basically my story in a nutshell. Chris had mentioned something about how do you recognize an unlawful order. For those of you who might go into the military, obviously those of you who are lawyers are going to be in a much better position because you're going to be much more familiar with the text. But it's pretty easy if to recognize an unlawful order. First of all, you got to know the law, right? And the law is not like Latin. Like the Catholic Church would have their priests read Latin to give the word of God to people, and the rest of us peasants, we didn't know Latin, so we depended on them to tell us what it is. Now, the law is not like that. We can all get to know the law. Law school is going to help, obviously, but it's not like it's required for us to study the law. So if you're in these positions, you need to study up, and it's pretty simple with the Constitution. It's a small document, and you don't need to know torts, and you don't need to know about coining money and all of this kind of stuff, but you need to take the time to read it and then figure out what your limitations are as an executive officer in the military. Yeah.
So what happened to you, Rick, after what ended up shaking out? your career from that denying that order?
Well, so the first thing that happened was the commander basically appeased me and just didn't fly me on that mission. Everybody knew that I was not going to be scheduled for that one particular mission, and that worked. There was a leadership change at some point though, and then the commander he wanted me to be a mission coordinator over basically the guy who's watching all these missions go on. And I told him, I'm gonna do absolutely nothing with that mission. I will have no. At any rate, they decided that they were going to revisit it, and so then they gave me the order verbally with a witness, and I refused. Then they gave it to me in writing, and I refused in writing. And at that point is kind of when the adventure had started. And I realized it's been like 5 months since I've refused this order, and even after I refused it in writing and verbally, I'm still flying the mission. Not that particular mission, but I'm still flying. And then what leadership decided to do, from the FOIA request and the emails we got, it appears that they were probably heading towards an admin separation. So an administrative separation. Basically what that means is, unlike a court-martial, I would not be able to challenge the legality of the order. It would be presumed lawful from the get-go, and I couldn't challenge it. Plus an administrative separation, although they kind of make it look like it's a judicial proceeding, it's not. So there's no rules of evidence or any of that. So it's basically, if you want to just get rid of someone, you do so with an admin separation. They took me off the line at that point. They also suspended my security clearances because I might be a threat to the United States for refusing.
Did they believe that you were somehow ideologically aligned with this terrorist?
No, nobody believed that. No, not at all. I mean, I'm a 15-year military officer with 8 deployments. I was there in the first night of Iraq. Nobody who knows me would ever dream of thinking that. So they took me off the line. They kind of put me into an office job where I had, for once, great office hours and lots of free time, and it was really a pleasure. But I was in limbo and thinking that, I was going to be kicked out and lose my career right at the finish line. And, and I was concerned, it could be worse than that. It could be a court-martial. I could end up going to prison. Court-martials, would make me a felon. I wouldn't be able to keep and bear arms. I wouldn't be able to vote. All of those things that they chose to go down that route. And it seems, though, like they were probably going through an admin separation thing. They changed their mind. I'll just leave it at that. And they gave me an LOR, which is just some nonsense paperwork to keep me from getting promoted, which I'd already been not promoted. So it didn't really do much. In response to the LOR, though, the LOR doesn't solve the issue, so I could be ordered to do the exact same thing a week later. So what I decided to do was resign my commission, and I filled out the paperwork, and I tendered my resignation. I said, look, boss, this is the only thing I can offer you that's going to solve both of our needs. I'm not going to violate the Constitution. I'm not going to violate my oath. You think that I'm, potentially poison in the unit because, of course, I'm telling other people, look, you need to own up to your obligations. This is game time. And surprisingly, the Air Force did not accept my resignation. Maybe because it would have went to the Secretary of the Air Force to get signed, and they were trying to keep this maybe on the wraps. I'm not sure why. But what they did do is, by suspending my security clearances, they tried to get those revoked completely. And then if they had done that, they could easily admin separate me without even discussing the issue at all. Just like, he doesn't have security clearances, he can't do his job, he's out. But in an amazing move, this is the only time I've really seen justice from the government work for me. The Air Force found for me in this, and they reviewed all of the classified information. They saw the order. They saw, my entire record, and they said that, quote, I think I can get this quote, on a surface view, it would appear that Major Rynearson doesn't follow rules and regulations. However, when looking more deeply into each incident, it's apparent that Major Rynearson is fully aware of the U.S. Constitution and objects to the violation of either his rights or the rights of other American citizens. I didn't butcher that too badly. I got it there at the end.
That's a good rubber stamp, or that's a good stamp of approval, isn't it?
Yep, made the Air Force give me back all of my security clearances, and then the Air Force turned around and gave me a really nice manned flying job, so I got to go back to the cockpit and retire, and it was great.
Did did you go to Air Force Academy, or were you OTS?
No, I went through ROTC at Florida State University. Okay.
And how much constitutional law were you taught as part of your military career?
I think we had one class on it, but it would have been fairly cursory.
Right.
Nothing real solid.
Here's a question. Could you have followed that order if you wanted to, if you believed that it was unlawful?
Could I have followed an unlawful order?
Yeah, I guess, does the UCMJ allow you to follow an unlawful order?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure that I've seen anything outside of LOAC that really says you can't follow an unlawful order. It may be out there. I think it's just presumed that all orders are lawful. I'm not sure there's a regulation that explicitly says don't follow unlawful orders. But I could be wrong.
Right. So, applying your experience to what we've been seeing in the last week or two with these kind of protests, you're looking at, some protesters are peaceful, some protesters are not peaceful. There's certainly some differentiation between the two. But how would a frontline E1 or O1 be able to recognize what is a lawful order and what is an unlawful order?
Well, that's challenging, especially when you're talking about here in the country.
Could you just explain what an E1 and an O1 is?
Sorry. E1 and so an E1 or an O1 is a brand new officer or brand new enlisted person. Basically, they've been in the military for 6 months, and they don't really necessarily have their feet underneath them.
Yeah, that would.
Sorry, Leslie.
That would be challenging because it's a somewhat challenging area of the law. I mean, to answer the question though, they would have to read up on the Constitution, and they need to know the Supremacy Clause. They need to know that there are federal laws that are created that are basically extending the authority of the Constitution, and they would have to read up on those federal laws. So it gets a little bit more complicated there. You'd have the I guess what's the law, the Insurrection Act that has been discussed recently, but there's other ones as well. Looking at the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 is particularly troubling to me. I think far more so than the Insurrection Act.
Would you like to talk about that as well, Rick?
Sure.
Just a quick overview of the NDAA of 2012.
Yeah, so the National Defense Authorization Act, basically the same kind of time period, and also under the Obama administration, President Obama lobbied for and got Congress to pass in that the ability of the president to use the military to arrest American citizens or legal residents in America or anywhere without charge or trial, and imprison them indefinitely if the president himself thought that they were terrorists or associated with terrorism. So now that law was challenged by Chris Hedges and several other notable people, and it went to a district court, and the district court judge, she knocked that down as unconstitutional. But Obama immediately turned around and had it taken up for an emergency stay at the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and they reversed it, and so that it was again quote unquote legal to indefinitely detain Americans without charge or trial in military prison camps. And then the court reversed it entirely in their decision, and then the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. So as far as the judiciary is concerned, if we want to repeat FDR's internment camps, that's perfectly legal to do now.
Except instead of Japanese, you just say terrorists.
Just say terrorists. Yep.
And terrorist is not necessarily defined. It's whatever the president decides is a terrorist.
That's right. So if he's tweeting that Antifa is a terrorist organization, that's enough.
And Antifa is not clearly defined because it's a decentralized organization. So it could be anybody that just shares ideals with Antifa, correct?
Oh, certainly it could. I mean, you'd have to ask the president and whatever team he's got doing it. But yeah, if you're Antifa or associated with Antifa, then you can be black bagged and never see a lawyer, never get a jury to and realize also is the backdrop here of this whole thing is thanks to the hero Edward Snowden and his revelations, we know what the NSA has been doing, and they've been storing information on all of our social media. They don't consider it a Fourth Amendment search unless they lay eyes on it, but they have the data in case they want to. Now, all they got to do is go, look for Antifa. Anybody who's part of Antifa, your social media could easily come back to bite you from 7 or 8 years ago or whatever that says, hey, this is a person who liked an Antifa page, said something about Antifa, whatever. They can start linking people up just like we do with the people overseas. He knows this person. He knows this girl, yada, yada. These are all associated terrorists. It could get nasty.
So kind of going back to your story where you talked about where you defied that lawful order, you looked around at the group, at the people in the room, and they were, there's obviously a disconnect between what you were doing in your ideology and what they were willing to do in their ideology. It brings me to the protests of, and we look at your career and what happened to you. You received a letter of reprimand. You offered to resign your commission, and kind of luckily the Air Force declined to accept your resignation. But a frontline National Guard troop in a protest who's ordered to use a level of force that maybe isn't reasonable or appropriate against a peaceful protest, my concern is, and why we're really kind of having this discussion is, they may not have the background information, knowledge of the Constitution to know what is constitutional and what is not, because certainly as an enlisted person, there was never a conversation in my entire 20-year career over what is a lawful order, what is an unlawful order, what is a constitutional issue, and what isn't. And Marcus, I don't know, did you ever have a conversation when you were serving in the Marines over what is constitutional or what is not constitutional? So there's very much the deference to your commanding officers that they would never give you an unlawful order, and that the commanding officers haven't invested this sort of energy, time, and research to determine what's constitutional and unconstitutional. They're just, it's just rolling uphill. And it's like you said, some guy writes the letters with an analysis, puts it in a safe, and everybody's trusting everybody above them that they've all done their due diligence to make sure that it is an appropriate and lawful order, when as it turns out, it's kind of not. And I don't think anybody here does, but pretty much anytime a JAG officer comes to Maine law, if you ever want to see me put on a show, you should come in for it. Because what I kind of talk about is I let them do their spiel, and it's kind of full of bullshit. And it's not like untrue bullshit. It's just, you get 30 days of vacation a year and you get to do this. And yeah, it's all true. They don't talk about the bad stuff. But, I kind of go back to in 2003, there was an OLC memo for the Bush administration that waterboarding was not torture. It was an enhanced interrogation technique. And I assume there was probably a CIA operative somewhere working in a black site that thought this is wrong. We are torturing people. And, for 8 years or so, if I'm doing my math right, it was a memo that said, this is a legal order. We have determined that this is an enhanced interrogation technique. It's not torture. We're saying that there's nothing wrong with doing it. And they might have had a moral objection to it, but they didn't have necessarily a strong footing to say no legally, unless it was somebody like Rick Rynearson that said, I'm just not going to fucking do it because I don't agree that it's legal or that it's constitutional. But what for me strikes me is around 2009 or 10, I think, Obama said, no, that is torture. We aren't going to do it. It is torture. And all I think of is there's whoever that CIA operative was that was waterboarding people or engaged in waterboarding for the last 6 years or 7 years. They were able to sleep at night because they were wrapped in the blanket of the OLC memo that says this is not illegal, which means it's not wrong and you have to do it to save your country. And as soon as Obama said that is torture, you have a moral debt that now strikes you, where you no longer have that protective blanket that it was legal to do. And you didn't necessarily have a recourse where you could keep your career, you could keep your benefits and say, no, you don't want to do it. And the conversation I have at every single JAG briefing is you need to recognize that in the military, you're going to be asked things that you find to be amoral, that you believe that is the very core of your being is wrong. And you might have to choose between doing the thing that they say is lawful and electing not to do it and destroying your career and maybe going to prison, maybe, a court martial, just like Rick talked about, where he might have lost all his benefits and been court-martialed and imprisoned and lost his voting rights because he wasn't willing to, in his case, he wasn't willing to kill an American without due process, which we all think that doesn't really happen, but the reality is that it does. So when I'm looking at these protests in Washington, D.C., and I'm looking at these 19-year-old kids, and this isn't a slight to National Guard and reservists, but there's a stark difference between somebody that's in the military 365 days a year and somebody that's serving in the military for, what you're looking at 50 or 60 days a year, because their exposure to the environment is less. And my concern is we aren't preparing our military with the tools necessary to recognize what a lawful order is, what an unlawful order is, what a constitutional violation and what isn't. I mean, how many of us started constitutional law thinking they knew exactly what the Constitution was, and then you read these judicial opinions and it shits out the other end? And me personally, I was big on civil rights and civil liberties when I started con law. When I got done, I said, it's a fucking pile of garbage, and they've bastardized the whole goddamn process, and I don't want to participate in it because I don't want to operate in a dysfunctional system. I don't want to contribute to that dysfunctional system. So I think it's fucking broken. So what young 19-year-old kid doing with the protest is going to have the wherewithal to say no? And that's where you're going to see genuine abuses because they don't know. And I truly believe that the military intentionally cooks ignorance into their ranks because they don't want people to say no, which is really interesting, because when you go to the fucking Hague, you don't get to say I was just following orders. When you commit human rights violations, you're prosecuted in international court, and you say, well, I was just a bulldoze driver piling the Jews into the giant gaping hole. Nobody gets to say, you don't get to say, well, I was just following orders, because the idea is you should know right from wrong and you should be able to say no. And I think we are positioning our military members intentionally to be ignorant of that. Rick, sorry, go ahead.
A couple of points on that. One thing I'll slightly disagree with you. There's a vast difference between what you think is moral and what you think is legal. Okay, so we are not in the military supposed to be an activist organization. Oftentimes people confuse these and they say you're going to find something that you think is wrong. What you think is wrong does not matter. You are in public service. Okay, you are paid a lot of money, in my case, millions of dollars, to train me personally to do a job for the American people. War is not a moral enterprise. So if you have issues with that, you probably should not have picked this job. But it is a public service job. So I don't care what is moral. I care what is legal, because what is legal is the collective morality of our society. That's my job. So even though I said no to this order, I can assure you, I happily said yes to many orders that would not make many people happy, and nor would they consider me a moral person for doing so. Now, that's just the nature of the beast. Okay, this is not necessarily a heroic enterprise. Okay, we are a stick in the hand, okay, of America. We are a stick, and that means we do what the hand tells us to do. Okay, now if you got a smart hand, then you're going to be great. Maybe you'll feel really good about yourself and you did great things. But if you have a very stupid or a very immoral hand swinging you, then you'll end up doing 7 or 8 deployments in Iraq, which was absolutely ridiculous and based on lies. But I did it because it was legal, not because it was moral. So there is a distinction there on that one.
Yeah, and we definitely disagree on that. But I don't want to monopolize any of the time. I have access to Rick all the time, and I bother him all the time. So you guys are welcome to ask him any questions or anything like that. I'm going to kind of shut up.
Well, I was just going to hop in. I think it's interesting, your idea of the dumb hand, smart hand dichotomy when it comes to soldiers and kind of being a stick in the hand of the United States, because traditional warfare, or how we have understood it over the past 100 years, is basically gone. We're engaging in either like surgically precise strikes from autonomously or remotely controlled vehicles, or we're doing some kind of humanitarian terrorist rooting out. And now that logic applies to our streets because now America ostensibly contains terrorists, as we call them Antifa. How can a fighting force avoid the human rights violations that are always at risk when you're no longer fighting on a battlefield and you're only in a town where there are good protesters, there are bad protesters, they didn't mark themselves, they're not wearing uniforms? Is it almost like that the military would need to evolve to be able to respond to these kinds of threats?
Well, it's complicated from my perspective. This is a difficult thing. My mindset, is we fight the enemy, and when we fight the enemy, we conduct ourselves in accordance with the laws of war. But I don't throw in human rights too frequently in that because, the business is, there are rules of war, but war is war. So trying to juxtapose that with, American citizens, I mean, that's difficult because, if they are considered to be terrorists or the enemy, it could go many, many different ways. Is this going to be a peacekeeping operation like we did in Bosnia? Are we there like the UN troops were? They were just peacekeepers. Or are we going in there as a more traditional? So it could go multiple ways. They're all concerning because these are questions we don't want to ask ourselves about, what kind of conduct against the American people themselves is okay and what's not. I would rather that question never be asked because it never happens. Now, that being said, I mean, our Constitution does provide for the commander-in-chief to use forces in times of insurrection and whatnot, and that's very sticky. What does that mean? So it's complicated. But to answer your question quickly and to sum it up, I mean, it really comes down to what are the objectives? What are that your commanders give you? Whatever you're doing, whoever the target is, and what are the rules? What are the laws of war, and how do they apply? Sorry, I can't be much help with that. Fortunately, I didn't.
No, I think I read something by an author who I really like. He's a French philosopher from the 1960s. He wrote that the war machine, the war power, has to move through smooth space. It can't be impeded by the kinds of things that we would consider at the level of state management. The whole matter of what is the right thing to do, what is the wrong thing to do. These are contemplative exercises. And what the war machine has to do is it has to topple and engage and destroy. And to me, it almost seems like we only have a matter of time before the American military will begin killing its own citizens if we install them in the cities. And there will be a sizable amount of Americans who see it as justified because of this floating definition of terrorists.
Yeah, that's a nightmare scenario. Yep.
No, and it's an interesting point too, Colin, because you talked about, the war machine needs a smooth kind of topography to move through. And that's really what World War I and World War II was. I mean, when I was doing a VA file review today and I was looking at the dates, like World War I was settled in like 2 years, and World War II, the U.S.'s involvement was like 4, 5, 6 years or something like that. And that's because there was no consideration of any of the things that we consider now. It's just steamroll the whole thing over and overpower and call it a day. And, kind of like what Rick was talking about, like the job of the military, war by definition is not a moral endeavor, right? Like killing is not a moral act. I mean, you can find a moral foothold when you're saying that person's the enemy for X and Y reason. But there's lots of stories that come out of different wars about combatants that drop their arms and kind of recognize that they are the same people of the same ilk. But the wars we've fought from Vietnam on are always about, it's a political process, and there is a distinct danger when war becomes an arm of a political sort of action or endeavor, and that's what war has been, in my experience since Vietnam, and and it's, to me, it just seems exceptionally dangerous because you're 1 degree of separation from, killing dissenters just for having a different political viewpoint. I think that's exceptionally dangerous.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous time, and sadly, people are asking themselves this question: what would the military do? And the answer to that question is not a good one.
Yeah, I can kind of agree with that. Like, I don't think you're going to find a lot of Rick Rynearsons that when they're told to fire on protesters will stop and take stock of the ask, the impact, and the constitutional issue, and make even if there's a lot of people in the military that recognize that they're doing something that either could be illegal or could be unconstitutional, but then there's a second calculus that's performed to determine if the cost, their personal cost of saying no, is worth, I would, I have a lot of respect for Rick, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone else that was willing to put the due process rights of a known terrorist ahead of their own career. Because when you think about it in that context, it's, doing the right thing when it's easy is not difficult, but doing the right thing when it's hard, that's where character is really kind of manifest. And I think you would not see a lot of military people that would step in.
I have a question. So my understanding of the military legal system is when somebody messes up, it's the military legal system that deals with it, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if something happened with the military policing American citizens, it would then be the military who would then have to reckon with it themselves, correct?
That's an interesting question.
Kind of.
Yeah.
Because we don't send our soldiers to The Hague.
Yeah, it would depend. I mean, in that context, depending on who's bringing the suit or who's trying to charge who, it could be the military that handles trying to charge one of their own soldiers. But if it's a protester, that could be something that's done would be done in a civilian court, outside of a court martial law being imposed. If martial law was imposed, then I think in that case it might become military law, but even then I'm not sure.
Thank you.
And what's interesting is if a military member is violates someone's civil rights operating in an official capacity, they have the benefit of qualified immunity as well, because they are government agents, and unless it was established or something, they would probably have the benefit of a summary judgment with qualified immunity. So again, you're removing a recourse that the public would get. And really, you would be hard pressed to find, unless it was a war crime where that military member was operating outside the rules of engagement / what his commanding officer had decided was going to be the course of action. There's not going to be a UCMJ. There's not going to be a court martial happening, because he's going, you told me to fire tear gas at the protesters, and I fired tear gas at the fucking protesters. And they'd be like, yeah, all right, we'll look at that again for next time. That's what I imagine would happen.
Yeah. And to piggyback on Chris's last point about how rare it is to find somebody who's willing to stand up, that's really true. In my experience, there were officers that I knew that I had these conversations with, and I heard several times, you're right, but I have a mortgage, I have a credit card, whatever. I literally heard that. And I heard one this officer went to the United States Air Force Academy. He wrote blogs and articles about the importance of the Constitution, and he folded. So, it's one thing to say something, it's another thing to do something, but that's not just a military issue. Like we were talking about before with lawyers writing memos, if you find yourself in that position, Chris brought up John Yoo. John Yoo did the same thing as David Barron by writing that classified memo clearly taking something that was illegal and defined as torture and claiming that it's not, knowing that all that's going to do is provide some sort of a justification for, for the executive. And I'm sure they're hoping that never would that even be brought out into the public, that they could keep everything secret. If you find yourself in that position as a lawyer, you're going to have to decide, do I want to do the right thing for my client, which is the American people? Do I care about their liberty? Or do I care more about my career so I can go be a court of appeals judge like David Barron, or a professor in California like John Yoo? See, these people are not punished. To go back to, again, what Chris was just saying, are they even going to bring charges? That's the problem when the power is held by an organization that doesn't have any respect for the Constitution. David Barron should be impeached, and he should be tried for treason. That's not going to happen, though, because he's in the power structure. Same thing with John Yoo. But if you're a person with no power, you're a protester, or somebody who's a dissident, woe to you.
Hi, Jamie. This is recorded too, so I can send that to you as well for the stuff you might have missed. You're still muted, Jamie.
Yeah. Old habits. Yeah, sorry I popped in late.
Oh, no worries. I guess we're at an hour now. This is certainly not a law school structure sort of thing, so it was an open discussion. I know Rick is a busy man, but if there's any other questions, you guys are welcome to ask, or if there's any other commentary, you're welcome to provide it. Otherwise, I'm probably going to wrap
well,
up.
I do have a question, and I missed the first part because I have a 20-year-old son who's probably going to join the military in some capacity. He's done like some sort of ROTC program right now, and my husband is a flight surgeon in the Maine Air National Guard. So these are real issues. So how do you combat it? Like, what do I advise him, or I don't know. It's like you identify these issues, but what can you do? Because the whole system seems to me to be structured so that you don't have people thinking for themselves and evaluating the decisions for themselves, because that can lead to other problems. You don't want to be situations where you don't want to be second guessing your superior's orders. Or does that make sense?
Oh, certainly. I think I can answer that. I'm not sure that it's going to be an answer anyone's going to like who's facing that. Certainly, probably not a spouse necessarily. But the answer is you have to make a decision to lose it all to do the right thing. There are no easy outs. People want to know, hey, what can I do? And the silent thing that's just assumed, and not get in any trouble and not lose my career. It doesn't happen like that. I mean, you might get lucky, but we're talking about public service, and it requires people of extraordinary character who are willing to give everything to do their job for the American people. And in the military, the easy part is going overseas and giving your life. The hard part that we can't get anybody to do is to say no to their bosses when their bosses are breaking the law. So there's a series, Band of Brothers. If your husband's in the military, you've probably seen it.
Oh, yes.
Great series. Lieutenant Spears is talking to Sergeant Blythe, and or maybe he's Private Blythe at that moment. And he's very scared. He doesn't want to fight. He's completely combat ineffective. And of course, Lieutenant Spears is just this killing machine. And he ends up with this conversation with this guy who's he's just so afraid. He's a coward. And he tells him, your problem is you think you're still alive. You have to know that you're already dead, and then go out and execute the mission. That's the way you have to approach public service. You have got to be willing to lose it all. Because if you don't bring that to it, you're going to be at a major disadvantage, because they will use all those fears against you. And the reality is you might lose it all. So it's a very difficult thing, but the answer is you need people to do that.
So my advice, and this is based off of my 20 years experience, but also a sampling from Rick's experience and my experience. Like Shadrach and Julianne, you guys have kind of read about my experience in the military. My best advice is call their bluff, because the reality is if they are giving an illegal order, either because they're ignorant of the law or because they're weak of character, they're just as fucking frightened of having any of that exposed. So basically you make yourself as legally thorny as possible. You let them know that you will drive it right off the fucking cliff and you will take their goddamn career with you. And then they, from my experience, they're like, all right, this, because what you do is you make it like, I'm willing to destroy my career for something I believe in. Are you willing to destroy a career just for convenience, or just because you don't feel like joining in the ethical and moral or legal fight? And a lot of them will just roll over. That was my experience. I positioned myself in such a way that it was very much akin to a dead man switch of if you go after me, I'm letting go and I'm taking down you, and you. And I have all the evidence in the world because I have positioned myself in such a way that I was not only was I expecting the fight, I'm eager for the fight because I'm prepared for this fight. And my guess is if you are of weak character, you're not as prepared for the fight as I am. And for me, I mean, I retired, Rick retired. And for us, it was because I think there is a look in certain people's eyes and faces of I'm here to battle. And if you're not here to battle, go away. And I think a lot of people go away. So my best advice is call their bluff and be prepared. And Rick's nodding, so I think he agrees.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, you got to be able to go all the way. And of course, if you consider yourself already dead and you're going out to execute, you're not falling for any bluffs. You're going.
Yeah.
And when they know you're serious and you're not playing games, like Chris was saying, a lot of them will back off. But the other thing is they respect you. Okay. So these people, these commanders that I was dealing with, they respected me and they knew I was right. Now, that doesn't mean they like me. They don't like me. Many of them didn't like me, but they respected me because they know I'm right. They're puzzled. What is this before me? A person who actually cares about what they're doing. A person who actually lives these slogans that we put up on these posters. It's mind-boggling to them. But yeah, you got to be willing to lose it. And that way, if you call their bluff, maybe it works out like Chris says, but maybe it doesn't.
Right.
And you got to be fine with that.
Yeah, the people that call the bluff and lose out, they don't hold Zoom meetings, so I don't have a sample size to know what their career outcomes were, unfortunately. But yeah. Any other questions? Anybody? Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Guard, does the National Guard get like different? I was reading those articles. It sounds like they actually are not willing to fire on their friends and family. I'm keeping faith that the National Guard knows what's up. I think that's
so. If you're, are you talking about the New York Times article I linked today and something else?
Yeah, basically, but like that idea.
But that's a onesie twosie thing. That's an individual sampling by the reporter of what each one of those Guard members said. And I've known enough people of lapsed character that they wouldn't. Because you have to also recognize that there's a severe cognitive dissonance that happens in the military, especially when you're faced with a difficult situation and you have to pick between your career and doing what's right. You're going to find a way that the thing you do for your career is also the thing that's right. You're going to create, how many times have we read a judicial opinion where in the first line that the judge already wants an outcome and he creates this obscure legal argument to reach the outcome that he wanted? That's going to happen with those Guard members. They're going to go, I don't want to lose my career, so let me find a way that these protesters deserve to be shot. and it's not hard because they're going to be presented with all kinds of evidence of overthrowing the government and terrorism and It's not going to be difficult. So there are going to be individual guard members that are going to go, this is wrong, I don't want to do it. But you're not going to see that. You're not going to see that universally. And what you're going to get is you're going to get some guard members that either are ideologically opposed to the protest, or weak of character where they're not really critically evaluating what's going on. They fire a shot. And as soon as a shot's fired, now it's going to be us against them, because the protesters are going to react as if they're being shot. Violence is going to increase. And now all the people that were on the fence are going to be on the defensive from what's happening as a reciprocity from the first shot fired. And then it's going to fucking devolve. So the trick is you never fire the first shot, but there's this constant escalation. And I don't have faith that universally the guard members, all of them, are going to not do something dangerous to me.
I tend to agree with Chris on that. However, I'll offer some rare optimism. 2 points. Number one, the guard members are, I think they have more of a culture of being citizen soldiers, of working for their neighbors, rather than primarily being this fighting, killing machine that goes out and spreads freedom and democracy around the world. So that culture might actually play out better. And the other thing is there is somewhat of a record recently of guard members refusing unlawful orders. So if you remember Hurricane Katrina and what was going on in New Orleans, which was a nightmare, we had police and other forces going through confiscating firearms in clear violation of the Second Amendment from people's homes. Now, they had active duty troops that were brought there, and they also had guard members that came in from out of state. And one of those guard units, I know, they weren't given the order to go confiscate weapons, but they made it known to their commanders up front. They had a discussion amongst themselves and said, if this happens, we will refuse to violate their Second Amendment rights. We're not going in door to door and pulling weapons out and pushing down old ladies, which happened with police. And so there's a little bit of optimism there. There's not a lot of it, though. I think Chris is more right than my optimism. But well, it was great to. Sorry.
One of my questions is that what would we do as a system? Because I think that it's not enough that the military knows the members know what is lawful and what is unlawful. But I think when we see in the news, as American citizens, we need to know. But I think that the civics education is lacking. I mean, I didn't have like a constitutional course until just now in constitutional law. I had a civics course that was like checks and balances, but I really didn't know what that meant and what an overstep is. So I think that not only an increase in military education, because I thought that was a really good point, Chris, that you guys don't really have here's a huge class on what's lawful and what's unlawful. But I think that as American citizens that we need to increase that knowledge also, because I think that will also allow for people to be like, I agree with what the military is doing, because there's a lot of people who don't agree with what the military does. But I think that if they see that the military is being lawful through everything that they're doing according to the Constitution, I think that more education is a beneficial thing for everyone.
You bring up the system, and for the military, the way it should work, and I know Chris touched on this earlier, because he talked about he didn't have any training. He talked about an E1 versus an O1. In the military, the officers are appointed and commissioned and subject to Article 6 of the Constitution to support the Constitution. So we take an oath to support the Constitution. Enlisted members take an oath to follow orders, and they also take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, but it's not actually required by Article 6. So this is more of an outdated concept because enlisted people are not dumb, savage peasants anymore. In the Air Force, you're going to be hard-pressed to find any difference between an enlisted person and an officer. It's not really there. However, the system is such that military officers are the ones who shoulder the responsibility for getting it right. Enlisted folks are out there busting their ass, doing the heavy lifting. They call NCOs like Chris the backbone of the military because they're the ones doing most of the work. I didn't have to work that much as an officer, but I'm required to get it right. Slightly different in the Air Force because, you know, as a pilot, I'm going to be the primary person that's out in harm's way. But in most of the branches, the officers are not going to be the ones that are out. It's going to be they're enlisted and sometimes warrant officers, if they have them, that are going to be out in the fight. The officers are going to work less. They're going to risk less, but they have to get it right. And they are supposed to provide the guidance. Enlisted folks are paid to work. Officers are paid to get it right with character and with through their thought process to provide leadership. Unfortunately, in my experience, if somebody gets it right and has any courage in the military today, they're more likely going to be enlisted than they are an officer. That's just an unfortunate reversal of responsibilities. But I would say hold your officers accountable. An enlisted person is supposed to be able to trust what their officer tells them. Now, they still have a responsibility to do the right thing to the Constitution, but not according to the Constitution by Article 6. It doesn't apply to them. That responsibility is on the officer. Officers are using your taxpayer money, just as I did, to go to college. So the woman who works at Waffle House, she didn't go to college, but she pays taxes, and she sent me to college. You know, to learn these things, hold officers accountable, require them. Now how do you actually make that happen? You know, write a letter, vote harder, whatever. It's a challenge. But maybe with your social media, if someone is in the military, hold them accountable. Don't just say, "Hey, let me buy your dinner," because you're wearing a uniform, and so I assume that you're okay because you're wasting money when you buy their dinner. Maybe instead ask them a few questions and see if they're worth it first.
And, you know, the reason I agree with that is because I've worked with a lot of pieces of shit in the military, and they don't, in my experience, and Marcus and Shadrach, let me know if I'm off base, most pieces of shit don't know they're pieces of shit. That's the reality. And like when someone thanks me for my service, I'm usually like, well, thank you for thanking me, call it a day. And I know they're basically atoning for how poorly they treated Vietnam veterans through post 9/11 veterans now. But a piece of shit when they're thanked for their service, that is an ego boost to them because they're like, yeah, you should thank me for that service. So anybody that is actively trying to collect accolades for military service is probably the one person that doesn't deserve accolades for military service. And you know, it's about accountability. There is a cost. There is a cost where you holding the public trust in your performance, acting on behalf of the American people. They're paying for your food, housing, medical care. Me and Rick have our military pensions for the rest of our lives that the American people are paying for. That is a burden, and you have to behave in a way that is right. Legally, I believe morally, but I also believe the country should behave in a moral fashion. And I agree with Rick. There's a difference between a lawful order and a moral sort of direction, and that's why I typically give the JAG interview hey, if you're given a legal order that you don't agree with morally, you don't have a recourse here. It's a legal order. You're going to have to do it, and that's something you're going to have to live with as a human being. But I digress because I feel like I'm going off on a tangent. Sorry.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for letting me chat with you guys as lawyers and law students, soon to be lawyers, and you know, recognize that a lot of this is going to apply to you. It's very likely that you're going to be in a position now. You have your client. You're going to give your client the best representation you can, whether you think they're right or wrong, because that's your job. But if your client's the American people, you know, remember it's the American people, and it's not the person that's writing your supervisor report or something. And I hope you guys do great things. Thanks so much.
Well, Rick, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day. And thank everybody for coming for the discussion. I appreciate it.